Thank you for joining us today for the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History Lunch and Learn, Hannah Watson and Women Printers in Early America. Our presenter today, New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, CC Borzilleri, is a PhD candidate at George Washington University, studying women and material culture in early America. And her research into women printers explores sources of authority in public and private during the early American period of 1770 to 1820. This project was an outgrowth of her undergraduate study of women who attended Sarah Pierce's Female Academy in Litchfield, Connecticut, which culminated in an honors thesis titled The Litchfield Effect, The Legacy of Miss Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Female Academy. CC's current research has been greatly aided by this fellowship through the New England Regional Consortium, and it included a visit to our collections at the Connecticut Museum. So we are very excited to hear about your findings, CC. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here this morning, afternoon. And thank you so much to everyone who's logged in to be part of listening to this today. As Jen said, I had the opportunity to work on my dissertation at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History over the summer as part of a New England Fellowship. And the stories that I'll be talking about today largely come from the Hartford area. And there are similar stories throughout New England that are all part of the larger project that I'm working on, studying women who participated in printing and publishing in the years during and after the American Revolution. What I like to say is that women were never the majority within the printing and publishing industry, but their labor was critical to many of the operations bound up within it, including many women who operated their own shops, managed relationships with employees, and placated subscribers and suppliers. They also embodied challenges to the inbuilt assumptions of masculinity and patriarchy that drove not only the print industry in the early Republic period, but sort of continued to drive the ongoing scholarship of that industry through the modern era. So studying women's contributions to the industry, both through the products that they created and the records that they kept, is a project that will hopefully give us better insight into the overlapping responsibilities, restrictions, legitimacy, and authority that women experienced during this time period. The main focus that I have for us today is Hannah Bunce Watson Hudson, who married the publisher of the Connecticut Courant in 1771. This paper still exists today as the Hartford Courant, and many people credit Hannah with saving it during an especially critical moment in its history. Despite her importance, though, there's much that we really don't know about her life. So something that I've challenged myself to do here is to go through and looking at the sources across the newspaper, the state and colonial records, genealogical information, and other things to sort of flesh out our understanding of her personal and professional life. Some of the images I have in my later slides today are from other women printers from roughly the same time frame who faced a lot of similar challenges to what Hannah did. So during the question period, feel free, please, to ask anything that strikes you about these, and I might be able to sort of make connections across the different stories there. But a starting point for discussing the life of Hannah Watson comes from a mid-1800s article written by the Connecticut Courant in honor of its centennial. And the article celebrated that the paper, quote, has always been self-sustaining. And this was initially sort of a frustrating thing for me to come across as a historian generally, and then specifically as someone studying women and gender, because it really anthropomorphizes the paper in a way that erases the labor that went into all of its success. But this is especially something common that happens to the lives of women, being ignored and overlooked when their day-to-day activities were considered something mundane, when in reality, they were sort of often the enablers of the things that are considered more historically exciting, that do get remembered in greater detail. So Hannah Watson's story is one of obstacles and clever means of overcoming them. Some of the challenges she faced were typical for women in that time, but others were a little bit more unique and presented her with the opportunities to define herself and her contributions that would form a lasting legacy through today. So starting with the basic fact about her upbringing, it's not known how she gained her education, whether that was something that her parents prioritized or something that she sort of went out and saw on her own. Either she learned reading and writing, though, from either her father or a member of the community outside of her household, because through at least the 1780s, her mother was unable to write her own name, as is visible on this picture on the left here. When Hannah's father, Aaron Bunce, passed away, her mother had to write her mark just as an X rather than signing her name, because she didn't have the reading and writing skills to write it out longhand. Meanwhile, at this point, Hannah had already been involved in the print industry in Hartford for several years. And just for sake of comparison here, when Hannah's husband, Ebenezer, passed away in 1777, we have this really great example of her signature in her own handwriting on the exact same sort of document that her mother would later sign. As is the case for many women in this period, the details of Hannah's life are generally unknown during the period before her marriage. As is usual for these women, her appearance is most often made when she gave birth, and her family was typical of the period in its sort of atypical construction. Her first husband, Ebenezer Watson, had previously been married to Elizabeth Seymour, with whom he had 2 children, Elizabeth and James. And then Ebenezer and Hannah married in August of 1771, just a few months after his first wife, Elizabeth, passed away. And then shortly after that, Ebenezer's young son, James, also died. In 1777, upon Ebenezer's death, several things happened in accordance with probate law and estate settlement. Hannah is appointed as the executor of the estate, which is not uncommon for widows. Often a widow would serve as the co-administrator alongside another male member of the community who is either a close personal or business associate of the deceased. When the widow was willing or able to take on the task herself, as was the case with Hannah, then there was not an additional individual appointed to the case. Secondly, the estate had to call for a payment of all outstanding credits and debits. This was something especially familiar to those in the newspaper industry, because the requirement for publicizing these sorts of notices often took place within the pages of local papers. So in any given issue of the Connecticut Courant and other papers of the period, the Watsons would be printing notices for several recently deceased individuals whose estates were in various stages of settlement. Hannah placed the first of these notices in mid-January of 1778, 4 months following her husband's death. And this was sort of a boilerplate advertisement that ran for 3 weeks, but she did accompany it with a more personalized note calling on subscribers to pay their local paper carriers any outstanding balances that they may have had. And she made clear to remind them that though it was a few shillings to each of them, the sum of delinquent payments would really make a significant difference to the operation of the paper and its ability to continue. Finally, an inventory of Ebenezer's estate was required in order to assess inheritance and potential taxes. This step took several years to be finalized, which I think is pretty understandable given that Hannah was surrounded by at least 5 young children and the responsibility of managing 2 businesses entirely on her own, in the meantime with trying to put together this inventory of her husband's affairs. So this task was ultimately completed actually in the mid-1780s under the care of Hannah's second husband, Borzilleri Hudson. Before that remarriage, though, Hannah spent nearly 2 years in charge of 2 businesses, the print shop that produced the Connecticut Courant, as well as the paper mill that supplied both the print shop and customers locally throughout the region. The evidence as visible in the Connecticut Courant issues at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History lends us some answers about how she managed both of them at once. So starting with the September 22nd issue of 1777, the Connecticut Courant eulogizes printer Ebenezer Watson in both content and appearance. The paper appeared with thick black borders dividing each section and surrounding each page, and there was a short tribute that appeared to explain the situation to the readership. It describes Ebenezer Watson as a gentleman of the most humane heart and susceptible of the tenderest feelings for distress in whatever manner discovered. Jealous of the rights of human nature and anxious for the safety of his country, his press has been devoted to the vindication of national liberty. And additionally, the paper described the kin he left behind as a melancholy widow with 5 young children and a numerous circle of friends to lament his death. Beyond this description, though, there weren't any personal details or appeals for assistance or otherwise atypical items filling that issue of the Connecticut Courant. Rather than bringing the reader into her personal dealings, this was sort of an early sign that she seemed determined to continue on business as usual. The first article that appeared on in that initial paper is something that I find really fascinating. It's an appeal to the ladies of the community to supply rags for the paper mill. The full notice reads, the owners of the paper mill in Hartford earnestly entreat the ladies consider their distress on account of the scarcity of rags. The business of paper making and printing is at an end if rags are not to be had. On a former advertisement, the works were plentifully supplied with this article, and the people were spirited to save every rag in their power. The spirit of late has greatly declined, and the ill effects of it will soon and severely felt. The newspaper must inevitably stop or be reduced to a half sheet. The schools will be essentially affected, and all writing business cease unless the ladies will exert themselves and show their patriotism on this occasion. Money is so sunk in its credit and the prices of rags so small that the encouragement in this respect is trifling. But the benefit accruing to the public and the essential service hereby done to the country is hoped will be prevailing arguments to arouse their attention and engage their friendship in a matter of such necessity, and so interesting to the people. It is 1,000 pities to reduce the size of this paper at this critical moment when the grandest events are turning up and in a day of such anxious expectation, and when it often requires more than a whole sheet to convey intelligence. 2d. a pound for clean cotton and linen rags or old sailcloth at the printing office and paper mill in Hartford and at the places where they have usually been taken in. So this notice is not an unusual way for a publisher or papermaker to address their plea, but the presence of it as the very first notice of a paper newly taken over by a woman adds an element of gendered significance to the prominence of this notice alongside that new female leadership in the enterprise. And then in the following issue, September 29th, 1777, a very early editorial decision that Hannah makes is she will be changing the date of publication from Mondays to Tuesdays. It's not entirely clear what the rationale behind this was, but she does explain that it's more convenient for management. So she is very much taking sort of that control into her own hands. Not much later, in December of that same year, 1777, an announcement of changing prices for the coming year seems to strain itself to avoid any sort of personalization. Written entirely in a passive and impersonal tone, the paper made this following announcement that the editor of the Connecticut Courant pays the greatest deference to the example of the public, but hopes not to be charged with disrespect for swerving from their universal practice of counting in dollars instead of shillings. And although the necessaries of life are advanced at the ratio of 6:1, hopes to be excused in continuing this publication at less advanced than 3:1. So this nameless, faceless, genderless editor, who we know to be Hannah Watson, seems determined not to reveal themselves to the general public. Unlike other widows of printers who drew upon their widowhood and their children's status as fatherless, sometimes they would even refer to them as orphans, there were otherwise sympathetic conditions that they had to appeal with. Hannah Watson's paper seems really to reject this idea of appealing as a person behind the print. The editor assumed no personal qualities besides subservience to the audience in a plea for understanding. So personal assertions of need, which under the circumstances would likely have been very compelling, were left unspoken in lieu of reconfirming the commitment of the quality of both material and content of the Connecticut Courant. In terms of the physical paper upon which the printing took place, the relative size, color, and texture of each issue can teach us about what was going on behind the scenes in her paper mill operation and in the print shop. The biggest cause for distinctions among paper stocks was a fire at the Watson Ledyard paper mill in early 1778. So looking at the differences across the size, shape, and composition of the paper does more than tell us about what would have been otherwise a fairly typical Revolutionary War era paper shortage. These characteristics also tell us about the variety of tasks required to make a newspaper physically come into being. Working with paper of a different size would require its own arrangement of article sizes, font selections, and other editorial decisions. Because unlike our modern newspapers, which try to present new and distinct content in each issue, many items in the Connecticut Courant and other papers at this time would run for several weeks at a in arrangements that varied very little from week to week. So this allowed printers to recycle the type that they had arranged for a given ad and use the same composition for a few weeks at a time without needing to disassemble and reassemble fresh each time. Up to a quarter of the newspaper could be readily laid out like this and set to go. But fitting this content to a page of a different size usually required this otherwise passive portion of the work to consume much more time during the production of the newspaper when a consistent supply of uniform paper was available. In the February 3rd, 1778 issue of the Connecticut Courant, Watson described the damage that the fire had caused at the paper mill that she co-owned with the Ledyard family. The damage to the mill included all its apparatus, 150 reams of writing paper, near 100 of printing paper, and a large supply of stock that was reduced to ashes. To further put these damages into perspective for her readership, Watson continued on to specify that the victims of this incident were the Continental Army and its officers, the numbers of schools, and the endless variety of private necessities and multitudes who looked to this office for amusement, instruction, and intelligence, rather than just talking about how it had affected her family. This concern for the public above herself is characteristic of all of Watson's public pronouncements, and perhaps it earned her the additional goodwill of those very members of the public for whom she expressed her care. Which again differentiates Hannah from the other widows who leaned on public sympathy for their private situations. Hannah pointed out her inability to provide the community with the service that they had come to rely on for her. Not until circumstances had become exceptionally dire did Hannah draw upon her audience's emotions for a plea for assistance. Through the loss of her husband and the financial strain on the printing business at the end of 1777, the editorship of the paper had remained impersonal and distant. The destruction of the paper mill threatened both streams of revenue, though, that she had drawn upon after her husband's death. So facing an inability to provide paper for her customers, nor for her own printing business, threatened the entire foundation of her financial livelihood. As a result of this symphony of factors, Watson printed the first legal mention of an obligation among the general public to repay their debts owed to her late husband. In any given issue, the third and fourth pages of the Courant generally carried at least half a dozen notices of estates needing to be settled. The absence of any calls for debts to be paid to the late Ebenezer Watson until his widow found herself without any other options speaks to the humility of Watson as a publisher and the impersonal nature with which she sought to operate her pages. Nevertheless, on February 3rd, 1778, below the apology for the fallout from the paper mill, the brief notice reminded the public that, under the circumstances, it's scarcely necessary to mention that humanity as well as justice obliges everyone who is indebted to the estate of Mr. Watson, deceased, to make immediate payment. And with that, the desperation of a widow who had tried for several months to distance herself from her personal trials and her professional business found herself unable to do so any longer. A lottery scheme was announced on February 10th of 1778 to raise funds to rebuild the Watson Ledyard paper mill that had burnt down in January of that year. Like her announcement of prices at the end of 77, her preference seemed to be an offer for services rendered rather than soliciting direct aid from her readers. The price of the paper was paired with a promise of quality entertainment and information provided to the readership. Similarly, the suggestion of aid for the Watson and Ledyard paper mill is presented as a lottery, so an opportunity for readers to enhance their own situations as well as that of their local paper purveyors. Lottery managers, with the official approval of the state of Connecticut, determined that this system would aid the public by not only repairing the loss of the immediate sufferers, who were the widows of Watson and Ledyard, but to the great importance that it is to the public to have a paper mill speedily rebuilt. An apparent sense of obligation to the public and desire to receive only what she was due for services rendered seemed to drive Watson's actions. While her printing career and personal resilience were tested, she continued to seek ways to benefit the public in exchange for her own support and well-being. Such an obligation to the public marked few printers, men or women, who often found frequent opportunity to put their own names in the print that they produced. A distant air of authority and an impersonal and therefore perhaps unbiased attitude reigned over the Connecticut Courant under Hannah Watson's leadership. Over the course of the calamities that Hannah faced at the helm of her businesses, something particular about her personality shines through her business decisions. Rather than appealing exclusively to the sympathies of the public for charitable generosity, she seeks to offer something in return each time she asks for help. Judging by the way the public responded to the increase in subscription rates is a bit more speculative, but evidence is present. Throughout newspapers in this period, a common advertisement came of the printer calling upon delinquent subscribers to pay up their overdue balances. Some printers, men and women, including Anne Greenleaf right here, chased subscribers across state lines to track down the money that they owed. So the Connecticut Courant was not a stranger to advertising calls for money within its pages, but these advertisements much more often requested that individuals who had placed ads in the paper pay their accounts rather than chasing down those who owed money for receipt of the paper itself. Another level of support that Hannah Watson sought was legal mediation as she settled her husband's estate. In 1779, Hannah Watson and Sarah Ledyard petitioned the Connecticut General Assembly for a resolution to an ownership dispute at their paper mill. The mill had been established by both of their late husbands, Ebenezer Watson and Austin Ledyard, which supplied the Connecticut Courant's weekly paper stock as well as to others locally. The dispute brought Ledyard and Watson in front of the General Assembly for at least the second time in as many years. Notably, each time they appeared, the General Assembly provided apparently helpful mediation and solutions to the issues that these women faced. These women were identifying the body as a place they could turn for assistance, and the Assembly likewise recognized the legitimacy of these women's issues as deserving of official government time and resources. There's not a distinction between the treatment that these women received and the men whose entries and appeals to the Assembly appear surrounding these Watson and Ledyard cases. With the legislature's assistance, the settlement of Ebenezer Watson and Austin Ledyard's estates could proceed with a clarified detail of legal right to the property. Despite bringing this as a dispute to the General Assembly for mediation, it does not seem that there was a significant long-term dispute between the two parties that affected their personal relationships. This is a bit of a speculative conclusion, but upon remarriage, both Ledyard and Watson, the paper mill appears under the name Butler Hudson, the names of the new husbands respectively of Sarah and Hannah. So ads in the Connecticut Courant and other papers in the Hartford area can be used to identify the owners of the mill as Dr. Daniel Butler, who married Sarah, and Mr. Borzilleri Hudson, who married Hannah. Later, Dr. Daniel Butler's name is replaced by that of John Butler, his son. So this ongoing association between members of the industry working in collaboration for a period of several decades serves to tell us a good bit about the way in which these two families lived and worked together. The composition of the Watson-Hudson family is somewhat uncertain at any given point in time. That's true for two reasons. Firstly, we don't know how many children Hannah had, and especially adding in the higher rate of child and infant mortality, it's difficult to say at any given point how many living children she might have been raising. But even more complicating for this question of how many children she had was the construction of her family. She married at least twice, and each of her husbands had had at least one previous marriage as well. All the more complicating, the first wives of both of Hannah's husbands were first cousins. It took me a good long while to digest that when I first discovered that. So the first wives of her husbands were first cousins. This created a scenario best illustrated through the relationships of Elizabeth Watson, whose parents, Elizabeth Seymour and Ebenezer Watson, both had deceased by the year 1779. And so Elizabeth found herself living in a household centered by her stepmother, Hannah, the stepmother's new husband, Borzilleri, and his children, who were not only her step-siblings, but also her second cousins. So Hannah's remarriage to Borzilleri Hudson surely streamlined her daily responsibilities, as he was already experienced in the printing business. But unfortunately for tracking the paper trail of her life, it also serves as a roadblock. Her name changed, thus unlinking any records from each other, and Borzilleri took over the public-facing aspects of all of her legal responsibilities. So the next time, if there was one, that she found herself in need of petitioning the state legislature, it would be Borzilleri who appeared and petitioned under his own name, whether or not it was in an effort designed for Hannah's benefit or for his. So the best way to examine Hannah's life is through this period that we've been looking at between her two marriages, so 1777 to 1779. And you can still find her name several places for a few years after she remarried. There's very little evidence that completes our picture of the day-to-day life of the Watson-Hudson household, but in death, Borzilleri revealed the closeness that he developed within this blended family. Referring to Hannah and Ebenezer's children as his in-laws, Borzilleri remembered them fondly in his will. Planning for his family's inheritance took place for him in the 1810s, after Hannah had already passed away in about 1807. The writing of his will also gives us an idea of the relative closeness of his relationships with each of the people that he includes. At this point, even the youngest of Hannah and Ebenezer's children would have been at least 21, freeing Borzilleri from any legal requirements to provide for dependent minors. For instance, the widow of his biological son, William, receives a regular and significant payment of $100 annually, whereas the children of Hannah and Ebenezer Watson receive a more nominal and symbolic one-time amount of $50 each. These relative amounts correspond both to the biological relationship as well as the network and responsibility that governed as much of the written and unwritten inheritance law throughout the early Republic period. Absent a Hudson husband, the nearest male relative of Mary would have been expected to support and provide for her. Again, these connections are somewhat speculative, but they're sort of an example of a sideways reading of many of these documents that give us insight into the life of Hannah and those in her immediate orbit. The connection between the Watson and Hudson families was not the only legacy that Hannah left by any means. After Hannah's publishing career, but still within her lifetime, her family members and those in her community made a significant contributions to the intellectual culture of Hartford, Connecticut. Even more illustrative of the close ties between these families, this includes Watson, Hudson, and Ledyard, then Butler. The most relevant organization that members of the Watson, Hudson, and Ledyard Butler families is the Hartford Library Companies, incorporated through the Connecticut General Assembly in October of 1799. Founding members of this organization include Borzilleri Hudson and his fellow Connecticut Courant editor, George Goodwin, and also Mason Fitch Cogswell, who was Sarah Ledyard Butler's son-in-law. That's not a stretch to connect these contributions of future generations together with the actions of Hannah and Sarah in the midst of the Revolutionary War as they sought to recover the businesses that their husbands had left in their care. Not just providing for the ongoing welfare of their own families, these women were able to build a legacy of intellect and wealth that contributed to the growth of Hartford as a social and cultural center throughout the 19th century. We also have access to the last definite record of Hannah's own life. Just days after her death, a short notice appeared in the Hartford paper. Died in this city on Sunday last, Mrs. Hannah Hudson, wife of Mr. Borzilleri Hudson, senior editor of this paper, aged 58 years. This, of course, pales in comparison to the treatment that Ebenezer received upon his death, and even it isn't the most notable obituary presented in the paper that day. The notice of Hannah's passing appears directly above a much longer one for a woman in Burlington, Connecticut, who lived to be over 100 years old, whose life and family the paper describes in great detail. It was not unusual for a person to have such a short death notice, though, and it really was remarkable when a woman received public attention in any kind at this point in her life. But it is still sort of disappointing not to see that sort of pomp and circumstance that she had previously given when her first husband passed away. I came across my favorite aspect of Hannah Watson's legacy, though, just a few weeks ago at the Clements Library in the University of Michigan. As I was looking through their records of print history and culture, I was digging into a set of papers belonging to a historian from the 19th century named Peter Force, and he was trying to write a history in the mid-1800s of the American Revolution. Most of his records were handwritten excerpts from newspapers published during the 1770s, including many from the Connecticut Courant under Hannah Watson's leadership. And that alone was something that I loved seeing because it meant that Hannah's records were being recognized as a direct authority on the events of that period. The absolute kicker, though, appeared when I was leafing through the records and one caught the light, revealing the Hudson watermark that it was written on. So Hannah Watson's legacy wasn't only present in the facts of the history, but the paper mill that she had personally petitioned the government to rebuild and save, that she had managed and administered with Sarah Ledyard, and that they had stewarded together until other management was ready to take over, was literally being used to construct our understanding of the period that she lived in. And I think that's such a great legacy. That was such a treat to come across, and really signals the sorts of contributions that women printers made that tend to be overlooked, but are exceptionally substantial in order to view the history of this period. So I'm hopeful that there are lots more discoveries like these still out there, and I'm so glad to have been able to go over this information with you all today. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
That was great, Cece. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions in the chat. We'll start with CJ asked, do you have any knowledge of Anne Smith Franklin, who was also a widow of a printer and left with children out of Newport, Rhode Island? It is often said that Smith Franklin was the first woman publisher and editor in the colonies.
Yeah, absolutely. There are sort of a number of women who sort of jockey for that, blue ribbon first woman printer publisher in the time period. But no, Anne Franklin is a really, really phenomenal example. She's a bit outside the scope of what I'm looking at, just because she was publishing in around the 1740s. So I'm sort of looking at when there were more women in the industry, sort of in that later 18th century period. But no, Anne Smith Franklin did a really, really phenomenal job as a well-recognized leader in the industry, and someone who wasn't overlooked for any reason, gender, skill, what have you, by her contemporaries and by those who followed her. And so there's some great records of hers that I saw through the New England Fellowship Consortium up in Providence, Rhode Island as well.
Awesome. Robert is asking, did Hannah get her news for the paper mostly by reprinting articles from other papers like New York or Boston, or how else would she get the news?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So a lot of the papers in this period would sort of have a cycle of reprinting amongst each other. So there were examples of reprints from different papers. Often they would credit the paper where they had gotten them. So if it was from Philadelphia, if it was from New York, you would be able to sort of trace back to the paper where it came from. They would also receive notices and letters from cities elsewhere that hadn't necessarily been printed already, but that had been sent with the intention of being printed as news, or that people locally had received from elsewhere that they thought were worthy of being printed as news. But another really great source of information that the Connecticut Courant was able to print a few years after Hannah Watson's time, but while Borzilleri Hudson was still there, the Connecticut Courant was actually selected as the paper in Connecticut to print on behalf of the federal government. So Timothy Pickering in 1799 selected the Connecticut Courant for political reasons, largely. They were a friend of his program, and so they were willing to print sort of what he was saying. But that ended up giving them a lot of content to print, congressional minutes and legislative proceedings, and a lot more official government sort of work in that regard. So that was another source of the news that they were able to print.
Was there such a thing as reporters at this time? Local reporters?
Sort of a gray area. There's sort of the printer, publisher, editor person wearing all those hats would often sort of contribute their own writing in this period as well. And then maybe soliciting regularly from folks who are writing poetry or prose. And so I don't know that there was necessarily, and I'm definitely not an expert on this particular part of it. But they wouldn't necessarily have had a writing staff. It would sort of been more collecting odds and ends type jobs.
And did Hannah write? Annie's asking, did Hannah write editorials?
It's hard to personally ascribe things to her for some of the reasons that I was sort of describing, that very impersonal sort of tone. It's as if the paper is speaking rather than the editor or a person writing the article specifically. There are definitely some examples where I'm like 99% sure that this is her voice coming through. But it's sort of hard to get that last 1% certainty that it was definitely her voice. So probably, but not that I can necessarily point to specifically.
Right. Robert had a few more questions. Did Hannah ever have any interaction with Benjamin Franklin? And do you know anything about his attitude about female printers?
Yeah. I don't know if she interacted with Ben Franklin that I can point to. It's sort of, no one in this period, especially in the print industry, is ever more than 2 or 3 degrees of separation from Ben Franklin. And that's true almost not in the print industry as well. So I'm sure that he knew of her husband, and probably her second husband as well. I'd like to think that he knew of her, but I'm not positive. But that first printer who was asked about, actually, Anne Smith Franklin, was his sister-in-law. And so her husband, James Franklin, passed away and left the print shop to her, and he continued sending work to her to have printed, when either his own shop or those of others were at capacity, sending things off to her to have done. And of course, they communicated personally as well as professionally. So he was more than glad to support women printers as well.
And Robert is asking, was the Connecticut Courant a Whig paper? Did it have any political affiliation? It was not a loyalist paper, I'm pretty sure.
It was not a loyalist paper. No, it was revolutionary. And then sort of like I said, it was aligned more so with sort of the government in the late 1790s, early 1800s. And so it was very institutionalized, sort of something that the government could lean on in order to reliably get their word out there.
And Lisa was wondering, when you showed the bucket, the fire bucket, and that was from Brattleboro, Vermont, did Hannah have any business with Vermont at all?
She did, actually. So her print house, as Watson and Goodwin. So right after after Ebenezer passed away, before she remarried Borzilleri Hudson. Initially, it was just the Watson print house, but then she took on George Goodwin as a partner. And the print house of Watson and Goodwin actually was the official state printing company of the state of Vermont when they became independent from New York in 1777. So the very initial constitution of Vermont and their very initial legislative proceedings were coming out of her print shop in Hartford. So yes, there is a great connection actually between the Watson family and Vermont print history.
Oh, wow. I know we talked about, you showed us her obituary. I was just curious, is that her husband that would have put that in the paper?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I figured. Any other questions anyone have? Can feel free to unmute yourself if you like. Cece, we did have someone asking if you would be willing to share your contact information.
Absolutely. Yeah, why don't I put my email in the chat?
I have an observation to make, not a question. I think it's interesting that even today, those same death notices for debt still appear in the Hartford Courant by law.
Interesting.
When you settle an estate, you have to advertise. And in general, at least in the Hartford area, it's in the Courant.
Isn't that interesting?
Some things don't change.
Right.
So Cece just put her email in the chat if you're interested. Well, thank you so much, Cece. That was really interesting.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, perfect. So a couple of historical, I work for the Courant, but I'm on the advertising side. But Ben Franklin is responsible for the Hartford Courant being in Hartford because Thomas Green came out of New Haven because Ben Franklin sent his nephew up to do the New Haven paper at that time. Thomas Green came up to Hartford and started the paper. And the first reporter for the Hartford Courant was Noah Webster.
Okay.
So that was later on, yeah. And George Goodwin was the first employee. He started 11 years old, bringing water up to mix the ink for the presses. So he was, when he became co-editor, he was like 24 years old and had been working there for 13 years.
Very small world.
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Thank you. We have one more question. Martha is wondering, are you studying, Cece, any other printers as part of your larger project?
Yes, there are quite a few. And I'll say, Professor King, I have your dissertation printed in a binder that I keep next to the rest of my research. So I try not to overlap with the ones you've studied too much. But I'm looking at Anne Greenleaf and Patty Fessenden, who I mentioned in the PowerPoint as well. There's Anne Barber, who's out of Newport, Rhode Island, printed a number of actually reprints of Anne Franklin's works that she took up upon herself in the same city to reprint as a woman printer just a couple decades later. There are definitely lots more. There's of course Ben Franklin Bosch's widow Margaret in Philadelphia, as well as the John Holt's widow Elizabeth, and then his daughter-in-law Elizabeth Oswald in New York City. There are a few dozen of them, mostly focusing on these ones who have a slightly larger record in the archive to draw upon.
Wow, big project. My goodness. Well, thank you so much, Cece. That was really, really interesting. And of course, if anyone is interested, we do have a new exhibit right now at the Connecticut Museum called Connecticut's Bookshelf. And Hannah Watson is featured in that, as well as other just printing and books from Connecticut. But I just wanted to end today, before we say goodbye, with just a couple of upcoming events that we have going on. We have a really interesting program on Thursday night, an in-person program. Really excited about the food historian Sarah Lohman. She'll be on site to talk about her new book, Endangered Eating, America's Vanishing Foods. And she'll focus on the history of apples, and particularly 3 apples that have been reclaimed from the brink of extinction. We'll also have New England Hard Cider Company and Longview Cider House on site as well, with some sampling, as well as Riverbend Bookshop, if you're interested in buying her book. And then on Saturday, we have our Dia de Muertos community celebration, which is an annual event at the Connecticut Museum. There'll be activities for all ages, including some crafts, mariachi music, Mexican folk dancing, ofrendas on site. Those are being set up all week. And then on Saturday, we have Saturday, November 4th, we have a family program jumping into the world of Richard Scarry's Busy Town, he is also a Connecticut author featured in Connecticut's Bookshelf exhibition. This event will include a photo booth and games, and you can design your own vehicle, and it is a free event, great for children 12 and under. So those are a few of our upcoming events. Of course, you can find all of our events at connecticutmuseum.org. And thank you so much to Cece. This was a really interesting program today. Thank you so much. And there was a lot of thank yous and great job in the chat as well. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.